All right. Let's get a stream going. I suppose I should eventually figure out some sort of I don't know, opening and ending screens so that the recordings don't start quite so abruptly, but we'll eventually figure that out, maybe. Um, that said, hello to the people who are here for book club. We are currently reading High Conflict by Amanda Ripley, and we last left off on page 74, uh, in chapter 2, I believe. Let me see. Let me make sure I am telling you the correct chapter. Yep, chapter 2, The Power of the Binary. Um, this book club is where I read out loud and talk to people in chat and then post it on YouTube so that people can listen to me read out loud if that is a thing that they want to listen to. Um, Also, just a side note, I'm recording this on November 4th, 2025. Uh, Maybe 30 minutes after Zoran Mondani got elected as the next mayor of New York City. And I'm riding a bit of a high from that. I'm very excited. Hello, Evolving Logic. Welcome to the stream. I'm just doing the little intro. Mayor Mondani, that's my mayor. It does not matter that I have never visited New York City once in my life. He is still my mayor. Let's fucking go. Of course, now that he's been elected, I have to really fucking rein it in because I will be dead before I will fanboy over a politician. So now I get to be critical, but I'm so fucking stoked. Anyway, okay, so we're reading from High Conflict, and this section we're talking about Gary, who is experiencing some political troubles of his own. I feel like we have lost you. By the summer of 2017, Gary's son Cassidy was starting to hear little passive aggressive comments from people he knew in Muir Beach. How's the president doing? People would say, referring to his dad by his title with an eye roll. He didn't know what to say, so he'd smile and change the subject. Gary's wife, Trish, noticed that certain people would no longer make eye contact with her. It made me really sad. It was painful, she told me. I became Gary's wife, and people didn't like Gary. One day, she told Gary she didn't feel like she had friends in Muir Beach anymore. She came to dread the monthly board meetings. The conflict stalked Gary, too. He'd wake up at 2 in the morning, his mind spinning with plot lines. He'd imagine ways in which he could force the old guard to finally and publicly admit that he was right and they were wrong. He'd replay the meetings in his head over and over. He tried meditating more in his lean-to by the sea. It didn't work. If you think meditation is the solution to everything, think again, he told friends. For the first time in his career, Gary could not take a 42-minute bicycle ride home to escape this conflict. The conflict inhabited his own neighborhood. This is where I live. This is where my children and grandchildren come to visit. When he took Artie for a walk, he'd feel the hostility emanating from certain neighbors. Someone told him that Hugh, a member of the old guard, had said that Gary was Napoleonic and didn't listen. It was incredible, Gary thought. The man who taught listening to thousands didn't know how to listen? He confronted Hugh about it, but Hugh denied ever saying such a thing. Gary felt trapped. The feeling of hatred coming at me is a nasty feeling, especially when you're walking the dog and you know people have said things about you that are not true, and you can't counter them because if you counter them, you're giving life to them. Hearing Gary talk this way was alternately reassuring and alarming. On the one hand, if even the godfather of conflict mediation can't help getting pulled into conflict traps, then we can all be forgiven for some of our pettiest moments. On the other hand, it felt ominous. If Gary could not resist the traps, what hope is there for the rest of us? That summer, Gary found himself obsessing over small things, building them up into huge issues. At family gatherings, he couldn't stop talking about the details of neighborhood disputes. There was the fight over Airbnbs and other vacation rental schemes, which seemed to be popping up everywhere in Muir Beach, stoking controversy. Then there was the continuing tension with the U.S. Park Service, which lingered long after the bus stop squabble. Gary would go on and on about every debate coming up at the board meetings. He wasn't seeing these conflicts the way he did at work, as a system to be investigated by listening to people's deeper concerns and nudging them out of an adversarial dynamic into one of mutual problem solving. He was taking things to heart, Cassidy said. He was getting defensive. There was a good team and a bad team, people who are for him and against him. You no longer felt like there was a real back and forth. He was sort of talking to himself. One by one, Gary's family members tried to intervene. At lunch one day, Cassidy confronted him. There is this kind of poison seeping into the house, causing you to lose sleep, and you just can't see it, he told his father. Honestly, it's bizarre to be the son of the godfather of mediation and see you have such insight into 99% of things, and then 1% of things, you have no awareness. Gary's daughter Sydney had her first child around this time, but her dad was always thinking about the board, and his tone was often short. It hurt her to feel this distance. Like her brother, she felt as though she had to say something. I feel like we have lost you, she told him. Trish complained that she didn't know who Gary was anymore. This is something the loved ones of people trapped in conflict often say, that they don't recognize their spouse or sibling or friend. One day, Trish said she wanted to move out of Muir Beach. That comment left him reeling. He replayed it over and over in his head. How could it be that his attempt to preserve the magic of Muir Beach had killed it instead? How indeed, Gary. The letter. Quote, in very few conflicts is one side whoop. Quote, in very few conflicts is one side totally right and the other side completely wrong. Unquote. Gary Friedman, Inside Out. She is quoting him at himself. That is very petty. I'm here for it. All right, the letter. Gary had 5 years in his term, but his ally Elizabeth was up for re-election sooner, in November of 2017. By then, the town meetings had become taut with tension. When government officials mandated that the local well water be treated with higher levels of chlorine to protect residents from a bacterial pathogen, the old guard began claiming that Gary had allowed dangerous amounts of chlorine to enter the water supply. They assumed the worst. Gary was appalled by the accusation. It was reckless and hateful. This is one way we get caught in a conflict trap. If we think someone is hateful, we are not going to try to understand them. That one was a bitter pill for me to swallow because there are some people who I just simply do not fuck with. And coming to terms with the fact that just because I don't fuck with somebody doesn't mean that they are, in fact, a being of pure hate whose opinions can be disregarded, um, was a bit of a come to Jesus moment for me. Didn't like it. Not fun, not exciting, but unfortunately, seems to be true. All right, if we think someone is hateful, we are not going to try to understand them. We may not even talk to them again at all. Contempt is the sulfuric acid of love, said John Gottman, a psychologist who studies marriage. The presence of contempt is the strongest predictor of divorce that he has found. And contempt doesn't even have to be present for it to feel like it is present. Gary and the members of the New Guard believed they were more moral and correct in how they were governing Muir Beach. But so did the members of the Old Guard. They thought of themselves as the ones who understood the water system, as the ones who had dedicated years of their lives to the town, but were being discarded and dismissed by cocky, clueless political novices, one of whom had won by a measly 4 votes. In the days leading up to the 2017 election, Gary realized that his side was losing. The old guard might win enough seats to retake control of the board. Tanya, the labor organizer and Gary's closest political advisor, suggested he do something dramatic to speak truth to power. Together, they drafted a letter criticizing the old guard. Gary signed it and posted it on the town's website. What I did is I fought back, Gary said. Point by point, he eviscerated his opposition. Well, that's what he thought anyway. You failed all of Muir Beach in your most basic fiduciary duties, Gary wrote in the letter, accusing the town's previous leaders of not conducting financial audits in the past. Reckless would be a kind word for the manner in which you and the previous board leadership handled our community's precious taxpayer supported resources. It felt urgently necessary to defend himself and Elizabeth, and Tanya agreed. You need to do a letter that's going to expose these lies. That's how you deal with right wing thugs. Some of the people attacking the water rate increase were the very ones who had failed to conduct the audits before he took office. This hypocrisy was too extreme to ignore. The fact that you are now criticizing details of recent audits, documents which you completely ignored in the past, strikes me as a remarkable testament to your lack of humility and almost shocking absence of any shame, contrition, or sense of responsibility. 6 times in the letter, Gary cited the failure to conduct audits, quote, for eight consecutive years. 6 times he wrote out the number 8 and then put the numeral in parentheses. It read like a legal brief he might have written at Friedman and Friedman so many decades before. Or if you are a millennial, it might read like a Tumblr post because that is very specifically Tumblr speak. He wasn't Gary the mediator anymore. He was Gary the trial lawyer. Surely, he thought, now that he'd laid out the facts, people would have to acknowledge that he was right. In my opinion, he wrote, you are lucky to have so far avoided administrative, civil, or perhaps even criminal inquiries based on your intentional and repeated violations of the law. As he got ready to post the letter, he felt troubled. Something was not quite right about it. Something about the tone. He didn't feel entirely good about it. He posted it anyway. The next section is titled, Those Guys Are the Worst! It is easy to believe that other people are vulnerable to high conflict, but not us. Even hearing Gary's story, we can convince ourselves that this was about Gary, his ego, his blind spots. Poor man. Surely we are different. We would not lose our minds. Not like that. Some people are better than others at managing stress and conflict, it's true. They can control their emotions and collaborate, even under extreme duress. These are the kinds of people NASA looks for when picking astronauts. The most recent class of 11 astronauts was chosen from a pool of 18,353 applicants. That is an acceptance rate of 0.06%, which means it is 75 times easier to get into Harvard than to get into NASA's astronaut program. With so many people to choose from, NASA goes to great lengths to select exceptionally resilient individuals. You depend on each other for your life, really, said Jay Bucky Jr., a former astronaut who helps astronauts manage interpersonal stressors in space. There is a high premium on being able to avoid really toxic conflicts. Oh my God, evolving logic. You got a little streak. I love that. Thank you. Oh yes, NASA. High premium on being able to avoid really toxic conflicts. Candidates undergo extensive psychological interviews, among other tests. Anyone who makes it through tends to be highly adaptable, socially agreeable, mentally stable, physically fit, and exceptionally good at working with other people under stress. Which does make a lot of sense. If I'm trapped in a tube with 5 people for question mark amount of time, then I also would want to make sure we all can get along really well under stress. Then, after they get accepted, astronauts get training on conflict management and communicating under duress. Their training, which includes simulations for managing conflict with other crew members, can give them an actual chemical advantage. They are less likely than the rest of us to experience dramatic spikes in stress hormones, the kind that degrade our ability to think clearly when we are frightened or angry. In fact, there may be no one better equipped to resist the magnetism of conflict than an astronaut. And yet, what happens on just about every mission? Even on every simulated mission? Conflict. It's inevitable. You can't pick a crew without conflict, said Kim Binstead, the principal investigator for NASA funded long duration space exploration simulations in Hawaii. You can pick a low drama crew, but not a no drama crew. And actually, pause there for a second. I'll put the brakes there and sit with that for a second because, like, granted, you and I are not going to space. You and I are not, like, we are not simulating, months in a tube together. But you can pick a low drama crew, but not a no drama crew. I think is worth keeping in mind for like friend groups, um, interpersonal relationships, coworkers, like any group of people that you are a part of. I think that it is foolish to say like drama free, no drama here, because then what ends up happening is inevitably there is some kind of interpersonal conflict, and instead of the conflict getting like dealt with and talked through, like talk it through as a crew. Instead of doing that, whoever the person is that brings up the issue gets ejected from the friend group because they are causing drama. When really, like, something happened that needs to be resolved. And instead of resolving it, the person who tried to resolve it is ejected, and the person who caused it stays in. And I have seen way too many like friend groups and especially like rave families disintegrate because of shit like that. So, something worth considering, I think. Astronauts take longer to get ensnared in conflict, much longer than I would take for sure, but it does eventually happen. And this matters now more than ever because NASA hopes to send astronauts to Mars in the next decade. A Mars mission will take about 520 days, which is longer than anyone can resist significant conflict, even an astronaut. In the longest simulation of a deep space mission to date, conducted in Moscow starting in June of 2010, 6 men from 4 countries spent 17 months living in a small concrete building pretending to go to Mars. I mean, there's some jokes I can make there, and I'm going to take the high road. They lived without sunrises or sunsets, without real time contact with friends or family. Each week, they answered a survey about interpersonal conflicts. There were 49 conflicts that they bothered to report. Presumably, there were more pittily irritating ones that didn't make the survey. There are, it's safe to say, unlimited sources of conflict in outer space, as on Earth. Crew members get distressed by bad news from home and take it out on one another. They have trouble sleeping and get on each other's nerves. But there is one particular kind of conflict that's virtually guaranteed to happen: conflict between the crew and ground control down on Earth. It's the power of the binary all over again. There are 2 groups: this one here in space, my group, and that one down there on Earth, the other. So a lot of the astronauts' frustration gets redirected onto ground control. In that Mars simulation, the crew reported 5 times as many conflicts with ground control as with each other. It was the new guard and old guard all over again. In space, they call it the ground crew disconnect. The crew thinks ground is asking too much, being unreasonable, being unresponsive, asking the impossible without knowing what it's really like to be there, Binstead said, rattling off all the ways that this ground crew disconnect manifests itself. Meanwhile, ground thinks, why are they being such prima donnas? I'm just asking them to do this one thing. Of course, ground control is easy to hate. They aren't there. They can't empathize with what you're going through. And on a Mars mission or simulation, it takes 40 minutes to send them a text message and hear back. There is no way to have a phone or video call with Earth from deep space, so all the conversations are by text. which means the interactions are stilted and unsatisfying. Stripped of the nuance that comes from voice tones and body language, text communication is almost guaranteed to lead to misunderstandings. Two thoughts here. Number one, has anyone told NASA about tone tags? I feel like it must have happened by now. There's so many furries who are like NASA people. Someone must have told them about tone tags. And number two, yes, almost inevitably, if I get into a fight with somebody like my partner, one of my partners, it's because of a text. And it's because I read the text as sassy and they sent the text non-sassy. And we don't have any way to know that. Um, except my own assumption that they hate me and want me to be sad, which on further examination is generally not true. Finstead is the Gary Friedman of space travel. She understands conflict unusually well. But when she spent 4 months sealed into a simulated space habitat herself, she too experienced conflict between her group and ground control. Even knowing everything she knew, she found herself in this very predictable conflict trap, just like Gary. When she talked about it to me over lunch, a full 13 years later, she still sounded peeved. I'd say to this day that ground was making a mistake. These days, before participants enter new simulations, Finstead warns them that this ground crew conflict will happen. They listen and nod and often imagine that it won't happen to them now that they know. It always happens, Binstead said. Then she added, laughing, "It's great to have an outgroup." Even on much shorter space missions, you can hear a note of tension in the stoic interactions archived at NASA. Consider this back and forth recorded in 1965 as astronaut Ed White relays his spacecraft's coordinates to ground control, a routine communication. White. Here, I'll do a little TikTok pantomime here. White. 013400 ground. Okay, Ed, let me correct you on that. It's 0134009. White. That's what I said. Flight. Ground. Negative. I believe you read 0134. White. Okay. I read it right the first time. Ground. Okay, you read the right numbers. You didn't read it with the right, beat. White. The right what? Ground. You didn't read it with the right beat. Astronaut White was not easily rattled. On that same mission, he became the first human to walk in outer space. But you can hear his disdain for ground control bristling just under the surface. Josh Ehrlich is a systems engineer for Lockheed Martin Space Systems Company and an aspiring astronaut. He spent almost 8 months locked away with 5 strangers in a Mars simulation in 2017. When we met for coffee in Washington, D.C., I got the sense that he is a generally pleasant, positive person. But he too had experienced tension with ground control. What surprised him the most, he said, was how this tension actually strengthened his bond with his crewmates. There are times when you'd get an email from mission support and you'd be like, what is this person thinking? They're nuts. And then you'd say, hey, look at this. And in those moments, it was like a bonding experience. We want to feel like we belong in our group, like we are understood. One way to instantly build that connection is at the expense of the other group, whether it's ground control or the Democrats or the company headquarters in San Francisco. Those guys are the worst. And like, again, I am sure that we can all think of examples of this. But like, I know, God, like the number of friendships that I have built over the years that like, started building the friendship because we wanted to talk shit about somebody else that we both mutually hated, frankly. Or like in-group out-group stuff, like you want to talk to people that you consider are in the same group or classification or whatever as you, and like might feel the same type of way that you do about the fuck shit that's going on, whatever that fuck shit may be. And like sharing the tea, talking shit. Like that, I mean, how else do you make friends as an adult, you know? This is a personal attack. Quote, when conflict takes over, it creates its own reality. Unquote. Gary Friedman again. Gary had barely called the meeting to order when Joel interrupted him. It was the last meeting before the election. Really disappointed, Gary, that there are 3 items that I asked you specifically to put on the agenda and that you very carefully decided you were not going to put on the agenda, Joel said, his voice tight. I think these are important matters, subjects that the board needs to discuss. Joel was a fellow board member, the same one Gary had persuaded not to run for board president 2 years earlier. Back then, Gary had liked Joel, enjoyed seeing him at neighborhood get togethers, but now he found Joel difficult. He talked too much, lost his temper too easily, and slowed things down, in Gary's opinion. One of the 3 items, Joel said, was the letter Gary had posted on the board's website. The letter was totally out of order, Joel said, and I am extremely disappointed that well in advance of this meeting I made the request to you, and you absolutely refused to put these items on the agenda. Gary responded with forced collegiality. I did, and thank you for your comments, and we can't talk about them because they're not on the agenda. It sounded like a theater of the absurd. Gary had refused to put the items on the agenda, and so the board couldn't talk about them because they weren't on the agenda. If we were going to talk about them, we'd have to give advance notice to the community by putting them on the agenda, Gary continued. So they're not going to be on the agenda for tonight, which isn't to say that they're not important and legitimate to be discussed, and we'll have the opportunity to put them on a future agenda. Another board member complained about her own issue being left off the agenda. Gary persisted. It's not on the agenda. A spectator yelled out, make an exception! Yeah! Another man shouted. Gary was losing control of the meeting, and it had only just begun. They hadn't even adopted the infamous agenda yet. Wait a minute, hold it, Gary shouted over the audience. Please, please. No, 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 no. Hey, wait a minute, wait a minute. I'm running this meeting. I'm doing the best I can. Please, hold your comments. Joel brought up the letter again. I would really like to know, and it should be discussed here, how a very inappropriate letter got on the website. This time, Gary shut him down immediately, without even referencing the agenda. All right, I'm not interested in responding to personal attacks. That wasn't a personal attack, Joel replied. That was, Gary said, to me. Somewhere deep down, Gary knew he'd made a mistake by posting the letter on the town's website. It was exactly the kind of thing he would have criticized his father for doing long ago. He'd felt queasy about it when he posted it, and now Joel was forcing him to reckon publicly with his failure to live up to his own ideals. Nightmare. Absolute fucking nightmare. Nightmare, nightmare, nightmare. Then Joel did something shocking, something Gary had never expected. I have completely lost confidence in your ability to serve as president of this board, he said, and he called for Gary's immediate removal. And I am making a motion. Gary interrupted him, sounding desperate. You can't make that motion. It's not on the agenda. It does not have to be on the agenda, Gary. Gary felt cornered. Just 2 years ago, in this very same space, Gary had talked about bringing the magic back to Muir Beach. His family had beamed back at him from the audience. He and Joel had been friendly. He'd even mediated a conflict for Joel's son once, years before. Yet here he was, presiding over a parody of a town council meeting, on the verge of being thrown out of volunteer office in a tiny town no one had ever heard of. How had it come to this? Gary's letter had triggered all the tripwires of conflict. Defending himself was fine. Doing it by attacking others out of hurt and anger wasn't. Not because it was wrong, but because it doesn't work. Blame, like shame, makes our opponents dig in. It's very predictable, like a law of physics, as Gary should have known better than almost anyone. By that time, I was pretty much convinced I was doing God's work, that I was standing up to Trump. In reality, Gary and his opponents were fighting over a $300 water rate increase. The future of American democracy was not on the line. No one's life was at risk. These were very fortunate people living in a literal paradise by the sea, arguing over small matters in the grand scheme of things. But that was irrelevant. The conflict defined everything. In response to Joel's attempted coup, Gary pointed to the board's bylaws, which did not allow for such a maneuver. Like a drowning man, Gary was holding on to the procedures and protocols for dear life. The meeting lurched onward until finally, 2 hours later, Gary opened up the floor for public comments. A neighbor named William approached the microphone. That letter, William said, was full of inaccuracies, falsehoods, libelous statements, and was just plain mean. Gary could not take it any longer. He jumped up to defend himself, his chair grating against the floor of the community center. Gary, okay, I just want to say I stand by the letter. William, no, let me finish. Let me finish. Gary, no, your 3 minutes are up. William, no, it's not. Gary, yes, it is. I've had you on the clock. William, no, no. In fact, William had only used 90 seconds of his allowed time, but Gary felt he had no choice. He had to put a stop to these attacks. He had to protect himself. William, the fact is that you were out of line. Gary, William, this is a personal attack, and I am not going to accept this. 3 minutes is up. No, stop. Stop. Your 3 minutes is up, and thank you. Look, personal attacks are not part of it. We have principles of unity. It was impossible, from inside the conflict, for Gary to see the irony. The spectators began talking over him. 2 minutes later, Gary made a motion to adjourn the meeting. It would be his last regular meeting as president. Which, like, yeah, bud. Yeah, unfortunately, that is about right. I was in awe of him. Hugh of the old guard had been Gary's neighbor for 23 years when Gary ran for office. He'd actually turned to Gary to mediate a property dispute with a Muir Beach neighbor years before. So he had thought initially that Gary would be the ideal person to serve on the board. There's nobody I would have trusted more than Gary with this job, Hugh told me. I was in awe of him. When Hugh heard that Gary was running for office, he'd been thrilled. In fact, he'd asked Jim, the board president at the time, if Gary could be president if he won. I thought it would help heal the tone, Hugh told me, dryly. So what happened, from Hugh's point of view? Talking about it, even 2 years after the letter incident, Hugh had sounded sad and a little mystified. Hugh had spent 16 years serving Muir Beach, first as an elected board member and then as the district manager. He knew a lot about the roads and the water system, and he thought that he was good at what he did. Before Gary took office, Hugh had tried to be efficient. He admits he didn't always communicate everything to everyone. There were no committees, but he did try to create a sense of community. Each month, he brought coffee and snacks for everyone who showed up to the board meetings, and there were no time limits on talking. Then Gary took over. Within a year, Gary had created 23 committees. Hugh still remembers the number. A major roads project that Hugh had helped launch 2 years earlier ground to a halt. Gary very intentionally undid everything Hugh had done, at least in Hugh's view. At first, Hugh tried to go along with the new system, despite his doubts. But when he tried to join the new personnel committee, he was told that Gary didn't want him on it. Gary felt that Muir Beach was too dependent on me. He hadn't even known that there was a new water committee until after it had been formed. I felt a little put off, Hugh said. I'd put in roads, sidewalks, pipes. I was certified in municipal drinking water treatment. It felt like I had useful skills. Gary had intended to be more inclusive, but he was excluding Hugh. It was as if Gary and Elizabeth had suddenly stopped tossing Hugh the ball for no reason he could understand. Until I spoke to Hugh, he had no idea that Gary had for years been referring to him as part of the old guard. That's not how he thought of himself at all. In Muir Beach, Hugh was the expert on infrastructure. Hugh got things done. That's how he understood his role in the community. Under Gary's regime, these things no longer mattered. He considered moving. He told his grown children that he just didn't like the feeling of Muir Beach anymore. Just like Gary's wife, he wasn't sure he belonged there anymore. Finally, Hugh decided with Jim to run against Elizabeth, Gary's ally, in the next election. Really, he was running against Gary, even though Gary's term was not yet up. He had his own group urging him to run, to get things done again. There were a lot of people in the community who wanted things back the way they were. Then came the letter from Gary, accusing him and Jim of all manner of mismanagement. I was floored, Hugh said. I went into defensive mode. The campaign got ugly. Hugh couldn't wait for it to be over. What really stung is that he had actually supported Gary's initial campaign. Like Gary, he'd expected to be appreciated for what he'd done. Instead, he'd been ostracized. Social pain can be contagious, and the more painful it got for Hugh, the worse it got for Gary. Paralyzed. The run up to the election, Gary said, felt like a cesspool. The town voted against the water rate increase, killing the whole thing. He was miserable, but he felt paralyzed, unable to do anything but watch the nightmare play out. He could not wait for it to all be over, just like Hugh. The conflict trap makes it incredibly hard for us to dig ourselves out once we get stuck. We know we want peace. We figure out what we're willing to compromise to get there. The other side does too. We're so close. But then we find we can't budge. The invisible forces that pulled us into the tar pits, including binary choices, social pain, the illusion of communication, and the idiot driver reflex, all become stronger. We don't want to be the first to make a peace offering, even one we're willing to make, because we worry this will be seen as a sign of weakness, and then we'll be asked to give up more. We don't trust that the other side really wants to make peace. Every objection to making peace speaks directly to our biases and stereotypes. We can't stop thinking of our side and the other side. This happens in even, oh, okay. Reminder, this book was written in 2021. I am reading the book as written. Okay. This happens even in bigger, much more intractable, and more consequential conflicts. For instance, two-thirds of Palestinians and two-thirds of Israelis support the basic elements of various peace plans that have been proposed in the past, and people want to live peacefully without the gauntlet of checkpoints or the fear of bombings. Yet, the conflict continues. Hoo boy. Eran Halperin is an Israeli psychologist who researches conflict. Whenever he gives a lecture in Israel, he likes to ask how many audience members have heard of something called the Arab Peace Initiative. This was a peace plan unveiled in March 2002 by Saudi Crown Prince Abdullah. Under the proposal, Arab countries would offer Israel normal relationships and security in return for its full withdrawal from territories occupied since the 1967 war. The plan represented a remarkable concession compared to previous Arab positions, earning qualified praise from leaders around the world. The initiative was endorsed by all the member states of the Arab League that same year, and re-endorsed again in 2007, and again in 2017. Halperin does not ask audiences if they support the Arab Peace Initiative. He just asks if they've heard of it. The initiative has been covered routinely in the news media for 19 years now. Quote, I've never encountered a situation in which more than 5% of people raise their hands, Halperin told me. It is in the media, but the people don't want to hear it. It contradicts everything they have in their minds about this conflict. The Arab Initiative is practical and substantive, and yet it doesn't even register. People have lost their peripheral vision to the conflict. They have blinders on, the psychological kind. If you believe that the other side will never change, that they will always try to trick us, that we are the ultimate victims, there is no reason for you to even bother looking for this opportunity, Halperin said. Americans, too, have become blinded by conflict. Democrats think Republicans are richer, older, crueler, and more unreasonable than they are in real life. Republicans, meanwhile, think Democrats are more godless, gay, and radical than they actually are. The most politically engaged people are the most mistaken about one another. I'm gonna pause here for a second. I don't know a whole lot about who Amanda Ripley is as a person, other than what she tells us in this book. Um, I am assuming that she was definitely on like the more progressive side of the political spectrum in 2021, but I have some personal feelings about the requirement or the like journalistic neutrality as a virtue. And I think that sometimes neutrality is in itself picking a side, whether the person in question realizes realizes that or not. Um, Now, this book is not about that conflict, and as far as I recall, this is the only place that it gets mentioned. But just making my position clear there. All right. Americans on each side imagine that almost twice as many people on the other side hold extreme views than actually do. Both Democrats and Republicans also dramatically overestimate how much the other side dislikes them. These mistakes sound trifling, but they can be catastrophic. If you feel threatened, you cannot feel curious. If you think the other side is more extreme and hateful than it actually is, you will vote for anyone, no matter how unhinged or divisive, to keep the other side out of office. About half of American voters in 2016 said their votes were defensive, based more on who they were voting against versus who they were voting for. Meanwhile, the institutions meant to help us become better informed seem to be having the opposite effect. The more time Americans spend consuming news from a range of sources, the more inaccurate their views of the other side. And the more education that Democrats in particular acquire, the more ignorant they seem to be about Republicans. Democrats with a postgraduate degree are 3 times as inaccurate in their perceptions of Republicans as Democrats who dropped out of high school. On election day, Elizabeth, Gary's closest ally, was voted out of office. It was Gary's worst nightmare. She and Joel were replaced by Hugh and Jim, Gary's fiercest old guard rivals, the ones to whom he'd addressed his infamous letter. Gary's term didn't end until 2021, and this election was taking place in 2017. Gary's term didn't end until 2021, but he had no clear allies left on the board. This was a beatdown. That's what they did to Elizabeth, Tanya said. It was self-interested, misogynistic, hateful. Gary's letter, Tanya thought, was not the problem. The problem was the lack of follow-up. The letter was great, but you know they're going to hit you back after that. Gary should have kept going, Tanya told me. He should have created a petition calling for an end to the hostile language and the lies. He should have knocked on more doors. The new board got rid of almost all of Gary's subcommittees. I got Obama'd, Gary said. The old guard was rapidly undoing everything he'd accomplished, just as Trump was doing at the same time to Obama's legacy, 3,000 miles away in Washington. They emasculated or reversed just about everything. I felt a deep sense of humiliation, pain, and sadness, Gary said. He spoke about the election in dramatic terms. We were thrashed. It couldn't have been worse. Listening to Gary talk this way was disorienting. It was like he was under a spell. I wanted to shake him, to remind him of everything he had taught me and thousands of others. Couldn't he see that he was trapped in a conflict, that the conflict itself was in control? Factions. Now, we assume political parties are a necessary evil for a functioning democracy, but as we've seen, America's founding fathers would strenuously object. Alexander Hamilton called political parties the most fatal disease of popular governments. In his farewell address, George Washington warned that they are likely in the course of time and things to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government. Yep, that's true. That is correct. Hamilton, Washington, Jefferson, and Adams recognized the power of adversarial systems to bring out our worst tendencies. Washington's family had come to the New World to avoid the violence caused by feuding groups, which had torn England apart in a civil war in the 17th century. When people get sorted into oppositional categories, high conflict becomes more likely, by design. In the legal world, Gary had created an entirely new design with a new set of rules for handling conflict, and it had worked. People flock to mediation all over the world, proof that adversarial systems are not the only nor the best way to manage conflict. But when Gary tried to change politics, just like he changed the law, he used the old adversarial design. He relied on advice from Tanya, who saw the world in binary terms. There was an us and a them. He was trying to play a new game under the old rules. It was as if he'd walked into a courtroom and tried to investigate the crockpot before a judge and jury facing a prosecutor. That could never work. But it feels like this kind of us versus them division is inevitable. What would another game look like when it comes to politics? Right now, some 5 to 7 million people currently do politics in a way that explicitly rejects adversarialism. They have done for democracy what Gary and his colleagues did for the legal system, created a new, non adversarial game, one designed to exploit our instincts for cooperation rather than competition. It's not a country or a city, it's a religion, one I knew nothing about before writing this book. But bear with me because this is a real life experiment that has been going on for over a century all over the world. And like, if y'all know anything about me, you know that I am not a big fan of organized religion. But this is honestly like super fucking cool. This is honestly rad. And also, oh, I gotta look up how to pronounce this because I don't want to disrespect an entire religion of people. That would be bad. Okay. How do you pronounce this? Pronunciation. Let's go. So sorry. Baha'i. Okay. Great. Thank you. The main idea of the Baha'i faith is that we are all connected. There is no us or them. Baha'i teachings revere Jesus Christ and the Prophet Muhammad, believing that all major religions come from one spiritual source. The community started in the mid 1800s in Iran, and it has spread just about everywhere. There are 150,000 adherents in the United States. The largest community is in India. But there are no ministers, no clerical leaders to run things. So, how do they make decisions? Each spring, everyone in each of the 17,000 Baha'i locations gathers to elect leaders. It's very close to a pure democracy, operating in 233 countries and territories. Here's the twist. Everything about these elections is designed to reduce the odds of high conflict. There are no parties in Baha'i elections, no binary categories are allowed. People are not allowed to campaign for a position or even discuss who might be the best person to serve. They can only discuss which qualities are the most needed. After a prayer, every Baha'i writes down the names of 9 people who they think have the experience and character to lead the community. Once the secret ballots are counted and the 9 winners are announced, there is no celebrating. When she was first elected to her local spiritual assembly in Atlanta, Georgia, Nwandi Lawson was working as a senior political correspondent for Georgia Public Broadcasting and anchoring a political show called Lawmakers. She had too much to manage already. In fact, she'd left the meeting early that evening to put her toddler daughter to bed. Then came a knock at her door later that night. It was a fellow Baha'i. The woman handed her a gift bag containing some scented lotion and said, "You were elected." "Oh," Lawson said. "Okay." She was expected to serve for 1 year, whether she wanted to or not. This is part of the deal when you become a Baha'i, Lawson knew. Still, she felt surprised by the choice. I had voted for other people. I hadn't thought of myself as someone who would be elected, Lawson told me. I was a relatively new Baha'i, and I was quite satisfied to let other, more experienced people run the community. That reaction is exactly what made Lawson right for the job. The Baha'is try to select people who do not crave attention and power. Being elected is not a status symbol, said James Samimi Farr, a Baha'i spokesperson. It's a call to further humility. This is the opposite of traditional elections, of course, which self select for people who yearn for recognition. Who else is willing to shamelessly boast about themselves in stump speeches and campaign literature for months on end? Who else has the drive to ask people for money over and over again? This is especially true at the national level in the US. Who else but a narcissist would have the motivation to endure the expense, the exhaustion, and the scrutiny of a long, contentious election? Once elected, Lawson began attending weekly meetings of her local assembly. They were charged with overseeing Baha'i weddings, managing the educational programs, and handling the budget for her community of roughly 80 Baha'i. Here, too, Baha'is try to constrain the ego and induce unity. In every meeting, they follow a protocol called consultation, and it's designed to allow people to speak their mind without getting too attached to their own brilliance. If, for example, Lawson suggested that the group expand their educational programs by partnering with a local nonprofit, that idea would become the property of the group the moment she uttered it. It would not be Wandi Lawson's idea. As a result, she might feel less of a need to defend the idea should other people offer up alternatives or criticisms. It wasn't about her anymore. None of this was easy, Lawson told me, because we do have ego. And when someone knocks your idea down, it's hard. It helps to keep in mind the principles that are supposed to govern these consultations, including humility and patience. And Lawson does not always measure up. It's a constant work in progress. To remind herself, she keeps a list of these ideals on her refrigerator door. Every time I get some milk, eggs, or butter, I need to look at it again. If, after some deliberation, her Baha'i group votes to pursue an idea, everyone commits to trying it wholeheartedly, even those who originally disagreed. If it fails, the group holds another consultation and reevaluates. I told you so is never permitted, Lawson said, laughing. Over the years, she's gotten better at learning to relax her grip on her own ideas. Not just among her fellow Baha'is, but all the time. She uses the consultation model at work and at home with her family. It tends to lead to better, faster meetings that yield more creative solutions. Yep, that does sound like a thing that would make it easier to get things done if I can let go of my ego. Ooh, oh no. Oh no. I like feeling smart and important. And like I'm saying it silly, I'm saying it jokingly, but it's also true. Like it's hard. That's really hard. Meanwhile, at the same time that Lawson was learning how to serve in elected office as a Baha'i, she was watching traditional politics come undone at work. When she'd first started working at CNN in the early 1990s, she'd been energized by the statesmanship of some of the politicians she covered, even the ones she disagreed with. But by the early 2000s, there was much less to admire. As the years went by, I was like, no, this is just people yelling at each other. Her experience in the Baha'i community has changed her understanding of what a political system could achieve if it were designed differently. There is a better way to figure things out, she has concluded, and it is actually kind of liberating to experience. The aim is not to get kudos for yourself or show off as the one who yells the most. The aim is to solve the problem. In those early days, she was surprised at how much her elected assembly could get done in one meeting, despite the need for consensus. Once people were actively trying to set their egos aside and work together, things got a lot easier. If social scientists designed a religion, it would look like this. The key insight from decades of research into group behavior is not that groups will always demonize each other. Humans are not inherently violent or evil. Warfare, in fact, is a fairly recent phenomenon in the arc of human history, first appearing roughly 10,000 years ago, when simple hunter gatherer groups began to settle down and became more socially complex and compete for resources. For 180,000 years before that, humans did not participate in collective violence in groups, as far as archaeologists can tell. No. The big lesson is that humans can be nudged to demonize or to cooperate. The traditions and systems matter far more than we think. If we took the same population of people and assigned them to one social world, we could make them really generous to one another. Sociologist Nicholas Christakis wrote in Blueprint, The Evolutionary Origins of a Good Society. And if we put them in another sort of world, we could make them really mean or indifferent to one another. This insight hints at how to fix social media and the internet generally. Platforms like YouTube and Facebook were designed to drain our attention and divide us. But they could be redesigned to reward cooperation and decency. It is not that hard. And can I just say, I am taking the first steps in that direction. I have started poking my friends on Facebook again. Since her first term, Lawson has gotten elected many times, serving pretty much continuously in some form or another for 18 years. Each locality also elects delegates who then elect a 9-person National Assembly, which in turn votes for an international body based in Haifa, Israel. The same principles apply, restraining the ego at every level of governance. All of these traditions are designed to help people understand each other and solve problems without dehumanizing one another. In this way, Baha'i elections are to politics what mediation is to the legal system, a different game altogether. One designed to exploit the human capacity for cooperation rather than competition. It's not perfect, but it is an example of what humans can do in a different kind of game altogether. Blurred lines. We are used to looking at every political story through the lens of us and them, winners and losers. The Baha'i model feels like a long way off. But there are incremental ways to reduce the binary in politics. It's not a mystery, nor is it a religion. First, give people more than two choices. It doesn't fix everything, but it reduces the power of the binary. Complexity doesn't collapse into us and them quite so easily. Ranked choice voting is one way to do this. Voters choose not just their number one choice, but their number two and number three choices, in case their number one does not get enough votes. That way, our loyalties get distributed, and more people feel heard, even if their first choice loses. It's not an all or nothing proposition. Another way to reduce the binary is to shift to proportional representation, where seats in Congress get allocated in proportion to the votes won by each party. This way, smaller parties can still win seats, even if they don't win a plurality of votes. People still have a voice, even in the minority. Globally, we can see the difference. People living in countries with proportional representation tend to have more trust in one another, researchers have found. They suffer from less polarization and see their political system as more fair, which makes sense since it is fairer. Even if their preferred party does not get the most votes, they still have a voice. They can still be heard, which we know by now is half the battle. Most democracies use proportional representation and have more than two parties. The United States is the exception. Its reliance on winner take all systems and binary parties is, from a psychological perspective, designed to create high conflict, which may help explain why the United States is more polarized than most countries in the world today. Yep, that's true, for sure. Also, side note, if anyone in the stream is not from the US, or if anybody not from the US watches this at some point, I did not realize, I had absolutely no idea that the two-party system was like more or less unique to America, to the US. I fully just like didn't even think about it, first of all. But if I had thought about it, if anyone had asked me, I would have just assumed like, yeah, it's the left versus right. Like every country is set up this way. This is how politics works. This is how government works. Um, yeah, American education system. Woo! Yeah, same, same, same. You just don't learn about it. Of course, voting schemes are only part of the solution. Many multi party democracies, including France and Brazil, are very polarized. But generally speaking, less binary systems make conflict a little less magnetic. To take the smallest possible example, imagine if, in addition to the old guard and the new guard, Gary had invented a third group label in Muir Beach. Let's just imagine he'd called this group the Safeguard, referring to the people who just didn't like to take risks. There were those people, after all. It would have made the labels more accurate and less caricatured. There would be us, them, and that other them. Binary thinking washes out all the details and contradictions so we can draw a crystalline partition between good and evil, right and wrong. It takes more cognitive work to keep that illusion going in other systems. In one experiment, 1,000 American adults were randomly assigned to participate in fictional elections. The Americans assigned to the traditional winner take all process perceived the elections as less fair than the ones assigned to proportional systems, where seats were distributed according to the ratio of votes. The winner take all participants also behaved less generously towards others after losing. They held a little bit of a grudge. That's how binary systems work. They cultivate grudges. Under proportional representation, the dominant parties still need to work with the less powerful parties to get anything done. They have to create coalitions. So there is my group, your group, and our group, the one we need to get a consensus. More people are in the room, so to speak. It's not exactly like Gary's mediation model, but it's closer. It's less adversarial because the categories are tangled up with one another. There are different ways to get less binary politics, but the larger lesson is clear. We need a politics that scrambles our innate tendency to see the world in binary terms, Lee Drutman wrote in Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop. By keeping political coalitions fluid and flexible, allowing enemies and allies to change. It works outside of politics too. In any situation where cooperation matters, keep the groups flexible. Avoid schemes that designate one winner and one loser, one group that's on the inside and one that's on the outs. Mix up the identities as often as possible. Want to decide if your church should allow interfaith marriages? Don't put it up for a yes or no vote, whatever you do. Want to open a branch office in Brussels or Detroit? Rotate your employees in and out on a regular basis. Don't let the groups stagnate and take on their own meeting. Avoid referendums. And for God's sake, don't communicate by Slack, Twitter, Facebook, email, chat, or text if you have something remotely sensitive to say. Unless you're on a Mars mission, there is always a better way. Just as we are wired to group people into categories and discriminate accordingly, we are wired to cooperate. The difference is in the design. Good institutions elevate our inner angels. Bad institutions feed our inner devils, Strutman wrote. Sometimes the binary works out okay. For example, team sports can operate with clear winners and losers most of the time, until violence breaks out or until people start cheating in order to win at any cost. But much of the time, in businesses, neighborhoods, families, and countries, blurring the lines between us and them is like buying insurance for your own sanity. It generates healthier conflict. Also, like, side note, professional sports, team sports, like, I really only follow hockey, so I don't know if it's the same in every professional sport or if this is like a hockey specific thing. I'm pretty sure that there is at least some amount of this in every professional level sport, which is that uh, players get traded like a lot, a lot. And like any player and here I'm talking about like the NHL, right? Any player that you would initially think like, oh, they're never going to trade him. Brad Marchand, for example, was the captain of the Boston team for a really long time, and he was like when you say Boston hockey, you think this guy for years, and they traded him like 2 years ago. He got traded out because he got too old, and they wanted new people on the team who cost more to pay because they're younger and like better at playing because their bodies aren't broken yet. Like this whole thing. Same thing happened in Chicago. There were Chicago players who words names escaping me right now, but like almost any team you look at where it's like, oh, here's this player that's like this player is the team. There's like a 50-50 shot that he's going to get traded at some point. So I think that's also part of it is once you've been like playing in the league for a minute, some of the people you're playing against, you were playing with last season. And so it's like kind of difficult to maintain really strict us and them when they were us last year, you know? Sometimes this blurring happens by accident. When I worked at Time magazine, I identified with the writer group. We bonded by complaining about the editor group. The editors deleted our artful turns of phrase. They made our stories shorter and more boring, or so we told ourselves. Then one day, the editors went on a retreat together, leaving us writers in charge. This had never happened before. Journalists were not, as a rule, big on retreats. But for whatever reason, we writers were each given a section to edit, and we had to put out the magazine by Friday night. This started out as a thrill. Finally, we were in charge. All was right with the world. As the week wore on, though, the exuberance waned. We didn't want to hurt one writer's feelings by reassigning his story to another person who we knew was a better writer. So we didn't. We were forced to make compromises. We had to be practical. Deadlines had to be met. For one week, we got to see what it was like to be the them, which made it harder to caricature the editors in the future. The job swap confused the categories. It would have been a brilliant management intervention if it had been on purpose. You can't easily default to the idiot driver reflex if you are the idiot. Knowing what I know now about human behavior in groups, I try to be more aware of the power of the binary. I avoid casually using the word them about other people. I notice when my friends or family talk about us, referring to their fellow Republicans or Democrats, something that did not happen 10 years ago, but now happens often. I ask them who they mean, a small attempt to slow down the binary. Are they now working for the Democratic National Committee? When they talk about them, do they really mean to generalize about 100 million people they don't know? At work, I try not to bond with other journalists by casually bad mouthing the editors or the younger generation of reporters. If my protege gets elected president one day, I don't want to end up on a stagecoach peeling out of town. But I'll be honest, I fail all the time. The temptation to feel righteous, to claw back a sense of agency, to deflect blame and seize the moral high ground is hard to resist. It's critical to try, but if Gary couldn't resist the magnetism of conflict, well, then we're all vulnerable. So the next natural question is, how do we get out of the trap once we've fallen in? Great question, Amanda. I am going to have some water. And if y'all need to hydrate, it's been about an hour. Amazing. All right. Chapter 3 The Fire Starters. Along the Tug Fork of the Big Sandy River, on the border between Kentucky and West Virginia, the Hatfield and the McCoy families lived peacefully for generations. Both families built log cabins, farmed the land, and hunted for meat. They fought for the Confederacy in the Civil War. They intermarried. There is no known evidence of animosity between the families for over half a century. Then, one day in 1878, Randolph McCoy visited Floyd Hatfield's farm and thought he recognized one of the pigs as his own. Hatfield must have stolen his pig, he concluded, and no one could convince him to let it go. So, McCoy complained to the authorities, who organized a trial. The judge appointed a jury made up of equal parts Hatfield and McCoy, 6 from each family. Then something surprising happened. One of McCoy's own relatives decided against him, causing him to lose the case and the pig. For McCoy, the loss must have stung, but he accepted the result. He did not take revenge against the turncoat relative. He did not grab his rifle and capture the pig by force in the night. The dispute seemed to have been handled, done and dusted. A full year and a half after the trial, however, 2 of his nephews got in a fight with a witness who had testified against McCoy in the trial. They beat the man to death. This was the moment the feud between the Hatfields and McCoys combusted, when a small dispute morphed into an intractable conflict. Over the course of the next decade, there was a vicious stabbing, a string of vigilante shootings, posse raids, and a Supreme Court case. A house was burned to the ground, a man was hanged, women were beaten. All told, about 80 different people got drawn into the feud across the region. Each loss compounded the next. At least a dozen people were killed. The dispute between the Hatfields and the McCoys became notorious, the quintessential blood feud. The war spirit in me has abated. The first mystery of this book was the story of Gary Friedman. How do we get drawn into destructive conflict, the kind that makes us lose sleep and ignore our grandbabies? Why can't we stop the spiral, even when it is making our lives worse? Even those of us who should know better. We've identified some of the invisible forces at work. The way that binary categories like the old and new guard or Democrats and Republicans nudge us into an us versus them mindset, collapsing complexity. How social pain, caused by rejection or exclusion, perceived or real, provokes aggression, which causes more social pain most of the time, even in a simple ball tossing game. And we've seen how cognitive biases keep the conflict going, blinding us to important details. In this maelstrom of emotion, it becomes harder and harder to access the understory, the real reason we're fighting. So, we get locked into a tug of war over the crockpot or the pig, while the deeper conflict burns on underground. Conflicts, like wildfires, do not all spread the same way. Some fizzle out, some go dormant for decades. What makes the difference? Confirmation bias is powerful, but it doesn't by itself lead to war. Why do some conflicts erupt, spreading like a contagion, holding entire communities hostage for years, while others simmer? The Hatfield and McCoy conflict started as an interpersonal one between a small number of people, not unlike the conflict between Gary and the Old Guard. In both cases, the neighbors involved had various allies in their corners and ways of categorizing one another, binary stories they told themselves. Like Gary and his neighbors, the Hatfields and McCoys had options other than violence. They were free white men with plenty of space to roam. They had a functioning legal system. Blood feuds were rare in the Tug Valley at that time. So what happened? We'll return to Gary to see what he did next and how he navigated the tar pits of local politics. Suffice to say, he did not resign. He did something much more surprising. But for now, our next story is about how conflicts explode when they do. We'll discover 4 conditions that can act as fire starters. These are the accelerants to watch out for in any conflict: group identities, conflict entrepreneurs, humiliation, corruption. These 4 fire starters speed conflict up and spread it around. They make conflict far more meaningful and essential than it was before, which makes any conflict much harder to interrupt. But not impossible. In 1891, Cap Hatfield, the second cousin once removed of the man originally accused of stealing that pig, sent a letter to the editor of his local newspaper in West Virginia. The battle, he declared, was over. I do not wish I do not wish to keep the old feud alive, and I suppose everybody, like myself, is tired of the names Hatfield and McCoy, he wrote. The war spirit in me has abated, and I sincerely rejoice at the prospects of peace. And that was the end. 12 years of war were followed by over a century of peace. Even violent conflicts can downshift, becoming tolerable and sometimes even useful. Most conflict, after all, is a force for good. It allows us to defend ourselves, to speak our mind, and pushes them to be better, and vice versa. For that to happen, the fire starters usually need to lose power, to be undermined or replaced quite intentionally. There is an unwinding that has to happen. To understand how people get out of violent conflicts, we need to understand how they got in. It's always deeper than it seems. I've known Curtis Toller for 4 years, and I've never seen him without a baseball hat. Usually it looks new, like it's never been worn before. He is muscular, taut, like a man carefully held together. Each time we meet, he starts out guarded, arms crossed across his chest. He does not smile. Each time, I worry that he is finally sick of talking to me, which would be understandable. I've taken a lot of his time interviewing him about conflict. But then he starts telling stories. Stories that are vivid, funny, unforgettable. And we stay there talking like that for 3 or 4 hours. Curtis spent 2 decades leading a large gang in Chicago, pursuing a vendetta that was as old as he was. He has been shot 6 times, and he's done 2 bids in prison. And yet, there is nothing inevitable about his story, he knows. There is mystery in every conflict, including his own. He spent a lot of time investigating the understory of his own life. I didn't believe I was just born violent, he told me. So I wanted to know, why did I end up being so violent? These days, Curtis prevents high conflict as a full-time job. To do that, he has to understand it. He has to study it like a treasure map. And this is something he loves to do. I've always been really inquisitive about my own behavior and other people's behavior. The second half of Curtis's life is a mirror image of the first. He's the same person, but everything is reversed. He works at a Chicago organization that targets young men most at risk of getting shot or shooting someone else. He listens to these young men and counsels them and shows up, even when no one else will. Curtis also works as an actor. He plays a version of his old self in The Chi, CHI, a Showtime TV drama about life on the south side of Chicago. It's a quality show, but for Curtis, it can feel like a vacation. I'm always telling the writers, it's not violent enough, he said, laughing. This is Chicago. Make it realistic. I wish I could do a Chicago accent. I simply cannot. My fiance is from Chicago, and they have tried to teach me multiple times, and it's just not taken. I either land in Wisconsin or I land in New York. I have not managed to triangulate the Chicago accent. In every gang conflict he encounters, Curtis tries to get to the understory, or what he calls the root cause. For example, there was one bloody gang rivalry that lasted for years and was still going on. All the guys involved had been friends at one point. They'd grown up in the same neighborhood, gone to the same elementary and high schools. Curtis started asking how the conflict started. He talked to a lot of people, including the principal of the high school, and he eventually learned the origin story. It was over a watch, Curtis told me, and then he laughed, a deep belly laugh, shaking his head. He laughed like this whenever he said something unsettling, I noticed, as if to say, can you believe this? Aren't people incredible? Someone had left his watch on the sidelines during a basketball game, and after the game it was gone. This watch was the crockpot, the proximate cause of years of violence. When Curtis stopped laughing, his voice was controlled and low again. The watch was not just a watch, he said. It's always deeper than it seems. So next time someone tells you it's not that deep, you have my permission to slap them. Just kidding. Just kidding. That was a joke. But for real, like next time someone says it's not that deep, it is that deep. It is frequently that deep. Humans are complicated. The origin story of a conflict often gets forgotten altogether, he's found. Sometimes the rivalry is handed down through generations, and no one alive today even knows how it started. A majority start with really small things in Chicago. A hat to the left. When Curtis was growing up on the south side of Chicago, he loved to dance. Not just any kind of dancing, but popping and locking, a kind of hip hop dancing where he made it look like he was dancing under a strobe light. But there was no strobe light. He would move and freeze and pulse and freeze. Curtis made people stop and smile when he danced. In this way, he was a lot like his mother, Rita, the life of the party. A model and a dancer, she was Curtis's original dance partner. By age 11, Curtis could do all the moves, from animations to slow motion to gliding. With practice, he learned to control every muscle in his body. Watching him was like watching a video that was glitching on and off to the beat of the music. He loved the way he could make other people gasp, doing things they thought they could not be done. As he got bigger, he got stronger and collected more tricks for he could make his body do. He and his best friend Jesse would hang out in the park and practice doing backflips off a low wall. Over and over again, they'd launch themselves off that wall to the rhythm of a bass line from a boombox in the distance. Two unstoppable boys spinning in space. That spring, Curtis watched on live TV as Michael Jackson did the moonwalk for the first time on Motown 25. He'd always loved Michael, but this was something else, something amazing. There he was, all sequined silk, gliding backwards on stage to Billie Jean. Curtis stared at the screen, unblinking, tears running down his face. That very night, Curtis got to work practicing the moonwalk. He put on his grandmother's white church gloves, pushed off the full-length mirror in the hallway, and grooved his way backwards over and over. He was so excited that his mom let him stay up to watch the late news, which promised to replay the footage of Michael moonwalking. Curtis played basketball too. He wasn't especially good at it, but basketball was religion in Chicago, and everyone had to practice. And Foster Park, located less than a block from his house, was the mecca of that religion in 1983. One day, Curtis saw something unusual at Foster Park. One player was dominating all the others. This guy was 6'8", the tallest person Curtis had ever seen in person. But the thing that mesmerized Curtis was the guy's grace. He ran the court with a kind of liquid ease. He moved like a cat burglar, scaling walls of players, defying gravity. You could just see that this guy was different, you know? The smoothness of it. He was actually a little like Michael Jackson that way. He made you gasp. Then, just at the right moment, he'd pounce, taking and making a heroic jump shot, the kind where you knew in your gut that a miracle had happened. Curtis had heard that NBA players sometimes played pickup ball at Foster Park. This guy must be a professional, he figured. Who is that? Curtis asked the girl standing behind him. That's Benji, she said. All the girls seemed to know Benji Wilson's name. But Benji was not a pro ball player. Not yet, anyway. He was in high school. A good-looking young man with dancing eyes and a slow smile. And here was one other thing. Benji had his baseball hat turned to the left on the court that day. A hat to the left, Curtis knew, meant someone was a member of the People Nation, an alliance of gangs that included the Black Pea Stone Nation, named after Chicago's South Blackstone Avenue. This mattered because, not long before, Curtis had become a stone too. So he and Benji were connected, Curtis thought, a smile spreading across his face. The feeling of awe he'd had while watching Benji play began to turn into something else. It felt like pride, the kind that fills your chest up. They were like family, he and this shimmering young man, living vicariously. Each of us has an infinite number of identities, arranged in a hierarchy that changes all of the time. We belong to groups we consciously recognize as well as ones we don't. Think for a moment. Which of your own groups would you defend if they were attacked today? Whose pain would you feel as though it were your own? And pause. I will pick back up here in a second, but as best I recall, she doesn't talk about parasocial relationships in this book, partly because it's really only kind of tangentially connected to this one section of the book, and partially because the term parasocial relationship didn't really gain like a ton of steam until more recently. And my guess is it just simply was not like very much on her radar. TikTok wasn't even on her radar for this book. So, like, the rise of people talking about parasocial relationships, I believe, had not really gone mainstream yet. But while I'm reading this section, that's kind of what I'm like, that's kind of part of this too, right? Is she's talking about living vicariously, and we're going to talk more about that in a second here. But I think that the internet and having internet celebrities and having such strong parasocial relationships with people that we've never met, there is like there's a great deal of living vicariously that we do, like myself included. I'm not the exception here. When we have somebody that we feel very strongly about and they have no idea that we exist, that does not stop us from living vicariously through them. And I think that that is, for example, perhaps a big part of why um Swifties, for example, are so feared. When if you can't say shit about Taylor Swift on the internet because hordes of fans will show up and like disembowel you for speaking ill of their queen because they're living vicariously through her, right? We None of us is a fucking billionaire, but if we can live vicariously through a billionaire, maybe it makes our lives feel like they're not quite so fucking trash, right? And that is I could say a lot more about that, but that is a bit of a tangent. So I'm going to get back to the book and living vicariously. Whose pain would you feel as though it were your own? Your family might come to mind first. What about your neighbors? Some of them yes, some of them no, I'm guessing. People who look like you, who vote like you. What about your countrymen? Loyalties are surprisingly dynamic. You might defend your fellow citizens if they were being attacked by outsiders, but the rest of the time you might not. You might feel like some of your fellow citizens are to be defended against. Strangely, I feel most American when I leave America. In other countries where I am seen as different, where I feel different, my nationality rises to the top. I find myself trying to explain America to others. Suddenly, I think I can generalize about 329 million people. It's absurd, but somehow very natural to do. In these moments, I can be very quick to acknowledge my country's failings, but it bothers me when foreigners make the exact same arguments. How dare they? I immediately think of several devastating accusations that I could level against their own countries, and then I stop myself from doing so. This is mostly an illusion if you step back from it. I will never meet, know, or even hear about the vast majority of my fellow Americans. But it's a powerful feeling all the same, one that can be turned on and off. Most of human history, there were no nation states, no country identities at all. Humans did not assume they had anything in common with other humans whom they would never lay eyes on, hundreds or thousands of miles away. But since humans invented national identities, we've gotten quite convinced of their realness, willing even to kill and to die for them. As soon as I am back in my own country, my identities reshuffle subconsciously. I become writer or neighbor or parent, depending on the moment. Other Americans become, in my eyes, loose groups of individuals again, more different than alike. Group identities are complicated, shifting, and powerful forces. They represent the first fire starter in Curtis's story. Powerful group identities like gang affiliations can make conflict far more volatile than it would otherwise be. They exert a force that is larger than the conflict itself. Whether clans or gangs or army battalions, groups generate vicarious experiences, spreading suffering and pride around like aftershocks. Groups can supersize conflict, turning a regular conflict trap into a prison. In a way, groups are like conflict itself. Most of the time, they're a force for good. Groups give us structure, safety, and purpose, making humanity's greatest accomplishments possible. Without groups, there would be no cathedrals, no pyramids, no World Cup, no symphonies, no eradication of smallpox. So, what makes group conflict so central to the human story spiral into endemic violence, trapping entire communities, sometimes entire countries, for generations? In the late 1800s, the Hatfield and McCoy dispute started out as a modest dispute over a farm animal. There was nothing at all that unusual about it at the time. But when the judge in the case chose a jury that was half Hatfields and half McCoys, he made it something else. Now it was a full blown group conflict, one that pressed much deeper loyalties into service. The jurors must have had various group identities, some of which overlapped with the parties of the dispute: men, farmers, war veterans. The plaintiff McCoy and the defendant Hatfield shared many identities as well. They were not all that different on paper. The most obvious difference was their family identity. This name separated the jurors as well. And so this identity must have become salient, rising to the surface during the trial. It's interesting to think about what might have happened if the case had been slightly different. If, for example, it had been a male Hatfield accused of beating up a female McCoy, then which identity would have been salient? As it was, the judge must have activated powerful family loyalties when choosing the jury. There were two sides, dangerously meaningful. Then, when one of McCoy's own relatives turned against him during the deliberations, the verdict became that much more loaded. The ruling against McCoy wasn't just a loss, it was a betrayal, a very public one. That kind of betrayal incites social pain, not unlike the sting of rejection experienced by Gary in his neighborhood. Still, McCoy accepted the verdict nevertheless. Remember that a full year and a half went by without major incident. But groups are hard to control. They contain multitudes. That is why group identities are such potent fire starters. It only takes one or two rogue cousins to create mayhem. After the cousins beat the witness to death, the conflict grew geometrically. Every time another family member or ally was hurt or humiliated, everyone else in the group experienced that pain too. And this also reminds me of, again, fandoms, like when fandoms or followers or whatever of a certain influencer um perceive that the influencer has been harmed, they will go after the person that they perceive as having harmed the influencer, often without the influencer ever saying or doing anything at all about it. And just either they don't know that it's happening or decide not to say anything about it happening. But the silence from the internet celebrity gets interpreted as support for what their fans are doing, even if they never told them to do it. Interesting. In laboratory studies, when people watch a loved one receive a mild electric shock, the part of their own brain that assesses the meaning of pain gets activated. Their brain responds as if the shock were happening to them, in other words. For those neurons, there is no apparent difference between literal first person pain and collective group pain. We viscerally feel each other's pain and each other's pride and joy. Basketball fans act differently after they watch their team win. They feel better about themselves compared to fans who have just watched their team lose. They even predict they will perform better on puzzles and games. This is, in this context, a charming quirk of the human condition. We live by proxy. We overestimate our own abilities, riding high on a victory we had nothing to do with. When Curtis saw Benji sink a perfect shot from behind the arc, he felt it physically, like a jolt of triumph, almost like he'd done it himself. In a similar way, each new loss or triumph in the Hatfield and McCoy feud was felt by not one or two, but 80 people. With every act of retaliation, 80 brains lit up in a similar way. This is how group conflict becomes a contagion. Let me see where we are at here. Okay. Yes, we have a bunch left on this chapter. Holy moly. So I can feel my throat starting to hurt. I'm going to call it here. We're on page 110, just about to start the section titled, quote, "You're not Latino, man," unquote, which we will find out what that is referring to next week when I pick up reading from there. And I will do my absolute best next week to finish chapter 3, The Fire Starters, although this chapter is super duper chonky, but I will try. Um, cat sanctuary. Yes, I would love to raid a cat sanctuary. Okay, I'm gonna stop recording and post the recording for everybody who's watching the replay. Thank you all so much for joining me. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you next week.